Welcome to the Eastern Approaches podcast, hosted by Alex Thompson. I'm delighted to be joined once again by Gevorg Virats, and it's suddenly time for us to review the Armenia Azerbaijan War. Last time we spoke, Gevorg, the war was just beginning to rage in the territory of Artsakh, known to the outside world as Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an enclave of ethnic Armenians within the Republic of Azerbaijan, at least in international borders terms. And we spoke at a time when Armenia was quite expectant of being able to defend the whole territory of Artsakh and perhaps hold on to the bulk of the land in Azerbaijan proper, which had been depopulated, but which had until 1994 been populated by Turkic Azerbaijani people. However, all of a sudden, one day in October 2020, we woke up to the news that Azerbaijan's troops had penetrated through that buffer zone and got into mountainous Karabakh itself, or Artsakh, and had actually captured its second city, no less, Şuşa, or known to the Armenians as Shushi, a very iconic hilltop city of huge historic value to both sides. What on earth went wrong, Gevorg? Because the last time we spoke, one of the points you made is that the Armenian army wasn't actually involved in the fighting as yet, as of that stage, nor were even all the regulars of the Nagorno-Karabakh self-defense force. It was basically first and second year conscripts that were doing the bulk of the fighting. So it looked like the Nagorno-Karabakh side was just warming up to a full battle, and before you knew it, Shushi had been taken. Please explain.
Well, hello, Alex. Thanks for this question. I would like to find someone in the whole of this region who would have been able to explain this to me. But I'm still to find that person. I think the knowledge of what happened pertains to perhaps just the very few that are involved directly in perpetrating whatever they have perpetrated on both sides, the Armenian and the Azeri. What was going on, from as far as I can see it, and I was able to overview the situation from all the open and not that very open sources that are available. All I was able to understand is that the battles have been going on. The situation wasn't nearly as drastic as the Armenian side is trying to present now. But all of a sudden, somehow, the Azeri troops found themselves in the city of Shushi. One of the questions that I had was, well, okay, how did they get there? And interestingly, the road to Shushi, the one that is the only road from the southern part of Artsakh to Shushi, that is controlled till today, is controlled by the Armenian army, or the Armenians of Artsakh, the regional army.
The NKR Defense Force, I think we call them usually.
Well, that's what they're called officially. You're very correct there. But just to make it clear to the listeners who they are, the Armenians or the Azeris.
We're talking about ethnic Armenians with guns were in control of the approaches uphill towards that city on the hilltop.
The only road was controlled by the Armenians. However, apart from that road, there is a mountainous. It is a valley, but it's not a valley as in you would have in Wales, for instance, where you have a consistent valley. It's sort of a valley with hills and mountains on your way, but there is this pathway which was completely forested, and
so a kind of mountain trail or pass,
something like that. It is extremely unlikely that any sort of a vehicle would ever be able to get to Shushi, to the city that has been taken by the Azeris, through that pathway. However, it turned out that even before the attack, before the Azeri attack, all the trees on that way, on that trail, were cut down. Some of the parts of the pathway that were more difficult for passing over were. To me, it looks like the Azeris have been invited there and given a pretty warm welcome. Now, within hours after some of my first-hand sources told me from that territory that the Azeri attack has been repelled, the news come in that town has been taken by the Azeris. So what happened there, I'm not in a position to say. Now, what I am able to say definitely is that Armenia as a country didn't use the whole of its potential in defending that territory. By no means was the whole of Armenian army involved in fightings. Also, the airspace in Artsakh was very scarcely controlled by the Armenians. Another question that many military specialists ask is, why is it that on some days the air of Artsakh was completely free from all the drones and all the airplanes of the Azeri army, but on other days you would have them flying in hundreds? What's that situation talking about? Like, how so? Now, of course, there's lots of blames going around. People say that the Armenians have betrayed Artsakh, and the others say that the Russians manipulated the situation in order to get their troops stationed in the region. However, I personally believe that this whole situation is a more complicated story than just this military skirmish, or even if we want to call it a full-scale war, which it was a full-scale war. I think there is more to the whole story than just the military part.
And that is what we intend to unfold little by little in the time available. Just before we move off the military plane itself, no pun intended on the word plane, but let's talk about the airspace. It has become known to people reading the news in English about this Armenia Azerbaijan war that Azerbaijan had acquired a lot of jets from both Turkey and Israel. And as you're describing, on some days they were buzzing Artsakh airspace. I know it's not a breach of international law to the Azeri side, but we're talking about the de facto situation. On some days they were making incursions with impunity over Nagorno-Karabakh. On other days they weren't at all. There's also claims, of course, that these jets were in some ways being controlled directly by Turkey, not even being given to pilots of the Turks' Azerbaijan allies, under whose airspace and air force they were officially flying. What can you tell us about this? Is there any firm indication that the Turks themselves were involved in their own air defense or air assets, and not just helping the Azerbaijanis?
Well, there are 3 points that I would like to make answering your question. Well, first of all, in terms of breach of the airspace and the international law, it isn't just the airspace of Artsakh that was intruded into, but also that of Armenia. That's one part of the story. Because as we all know, and our listeners might be interested to know as well, this war ended when the Russian military helicopter was downed in Armenia. And the Azeri officials immediately took the blame for it But there are allegations, and pretty serious ones, that it was actually hit by the Turks in order to make sure that this war continues.
But in fact, this was the last day of the war, so rather than prolonging the war, it rather urgently foreshortened it. It has overtones here of the downing of the Sukhoi in Idlib in Syria by the Turks, which they held their hands up to because there they didn't have any local Turkic allies to blame it on. But in this case, you're saying Azerbaijan held their hands up and said, sorry, it was us, not our big brother Turkey. But what happened in the next few hours, and what were the ground movements? Somewhat surprising to me. You'll have to outline it for the listeners, but Armenia proper has a Russian base on the Turkish border in Gyumri, in the northwest of Armenia, right the other end of the country. It's a small country, I know, but right the other end from Artsakh at the eastern end of the Armenian ethnic territory. And all of a sudden, the Russians come in by ground a few hours after the downing of the helicopter. What happened in the interim?
Alex, before I answer this, I would like to continue to my second and third points regarding the airspace, because this will answer part of what you're asking now. The first thing is that yes, Turkey and Armenia and Azerbaijan were dominating the Armenian airspace and airways and military bases in Erzurum and Igdir in Turkey. These were the centers from where the control over the airspace in the South Caucasus was monitored and exercised. But the second part of this is that the Armenian side, the Armenians and the Russians, they are, well, since Armenia is part of the Russian-led military alliance, the Armenians and the Russians have common air defense system. So it isn't just up to the Armenian side to act in its airspace, but decisions are made together with the Russians on every occasion when the action is needed.
It's the air defense equivalent of NORAD in North America. The Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, has the same thing, doesn't it? So effectively, Armenian and Russian Air Force generals are conferring on what steps to take.
It's an agreement between Armenia and Russia in particular, even though it is within the frameworks of CSTO. It's still Armenia. It's bilateral between Armenia and Russia, and that's how it is different to the NATO system, where you would have every member of NATO have a say in what's happening in North America and Europe. In this particular instance, it's just a two-party undertaking. But what's important here is that everything that has been happening in Artsakh in terms of protecting airspace was also influenced by the decisions that the Armenian side has made together with the Russians. Interestingly, on some days they were able to effectively seal the air off, and on other days something went wrong and they weren't able to do that anymore. So that's another question that needs to be answered. But the third point that I was making is that because most of the drones that Azerbaijan has been using against Artsakh are Israeli drones, they were purchased in Israel, and some of them were assembled in Azerbaijan by the Israelis.
Or possibly even crewed and demonstrated by Israeli contractors on the ground in Azerbaijan, is the accusation. Because this is an underbelly of how drones are sold by Israel and other such countries these days, is that in a hot war situation, the trainers will say, look, we'll shoot down an enemy plane live for you to demonstrate it.
Well, that's happened before, and there was a huge scandal in Israel because that was revealed, and the Armenians were able to actually prove that this is what has been happening in 2016. But now the allegations are that they were masterminded and ruled from Israel itself, or they didn't even need to have anyone present on the territory of Azerbaijan in order to lead the situation with drones. One could be sitting in Israel and playing this video game, killing people and destroying buildings. And who's there to catch them and to say, well, you have been doing this now, you naughty boy, behave better. So the information that we have at the moment is that at least Israel and Turkey, but also other countries such as Hungary, such as Ukraine, such as others, these countries have been heavily involved in what has been going on in terms of the airspace and air protection. Now, getting back to your question about the Russians and how did the Russians appear in Artsakh, I'll start answering this from the end, kind of, because the agreement that was eventually put in place by the Armenians, the Azeris, and the Russians, the agreement that ended the war, it states that the Russians are allowed to have a military peacekeeping personnel in Artsakh amounting to 2,000 people. Anyone who will go to Artsakh today will be able to witness that there are many, many more people than just the 2,000, many more Russians. So the Russians were in Armenia, and they were flying into Armenia non-stop, like during the whole period of the war. The Armenian border with the Artsakh territory was accumulating all the Russian troops, starting from October the 11th and all the way till November when the war was stopped. So the plan to have the Russians involved was not something that was made spontaneously. The Russians have premeditated their involvement, and this is another reason why many are led to believe that this whole situation is not as clear as the governments today say that it is.
Let's then go on and talk about President Putin's personal involvement, because in general terms, the two heads of state, the international law states involved directly, are Nikol Pashinyan in Armenia and, of course, he's not head of state, but head of government, prime minister, and Ilham Aliyev in Azerbaijan, the president, and it's a presidential system there, so he's the as much the boss as the US president is in the US. Now, Aliyev is the son of a dynastic founder and in some ways is said to be on his way out because of growing discontent, at least until the great PR boost of suddenly being able to send the refugees home who've spent 20 odd years in refugee camps back to the area that Armenia had taken as a buffer zone. But Aliyev is a jaded older politician representing an oil and Soviet dynasty. Pashinyan is often, for short, described as a Sorosite or a pro-EU man, particularly those who watch Kevork Almasyan's Syriana analysis. Of course, he's an ethnic-Armenian in Syria. He would take that line very strongly. So it's a bit of a caricature, but you've got the Soviet strongman and the Sorosite heading up the two governments and militaries involved. Putin, of course, is the wily wolf in the picture, and he has, in interviews since the November ceasefire, spoken about his attempts during the summer to knock heads together, because Russia does have complicated interests with both sides, with the peoples, with the economies, and with the militaries, particularly with Armenia, and doesn't want to be encircled, and has other peacekeeping roles in the South Caucasus, in neighboring Georgia as well. So a complicated picture, and Putin appeared something like an elder statesman, or probably that was the image he was trying to project, when he said to interviewers, look, we nearly had an agreement, something akin to the Palestinian rights to return, the way that that's usually sold, in summer. But Mr. Pashinyan said, sorry, this is an existential threat to the Armenian nation, one of the points of the agreement. But Putin's point was, look, they would have got the de facto outcome of this war and kept the historic flagship town of Shushi if they had gone with the Russian agreement. It's almost like there was something pre-cooked from the Russian side about this outcome, the kind of maximum that Armenia could hope for while under the Russian security blanket. Would that be fair?
More or less. Just recently, a discussion between Armenia's previous president and the president of Belarus was revealed, a recording of that discussion, where the president of Belarus asks the Armenian president to release the 7 regions that were occupied by the Armenians to protect the Armenian population of Artsakh.
This buffer zone around Nagorno-Karabakh.
Yeah, the buffer zone, exactly. That Lukashenko asks Serge Sargsyan, says, do you release them? Your resistance to the idea of releasing these territories is rather weak as a point. To which Serge Sargsyan says, well, we had people who died liberating this territory, and I couldn't do that. And the answer of Lukashenko is this: well, look, Aliyev is going to pay you. He's pledged you $5 billion as a first installment. Why don't you go on with that? And then there is another answer that the Armenian president gives. The Armenian president said, well, I'll give Aliyev $6 billion and let him just refuse these territories. So there's been this bargaining going on for a long time. Now, from the international law standpoint, Armenia couldn't lay a legitimate claim to those 7 territories, the buffer zone, because they were part of Azerbaijan. The whole world recognizes them as a part of Azerbaijan. And even
of course, because the ethnic Azeris were only leaving those under shelling as recently as 1994, so they had to return in the end to those territories.
It's the question of their return is another question. It's more of a humanitarian question, but I'm talking about the legitimate ownership of those territories. Those territories, legally, according to all international norms, were part of Azerbaijan, and Armenia's holding up to that territory hasn't been legal. Now that Armenia has been doing it, and then it wasn't officially Armenia, it was the Armenians of Artsakh, the NKR Defense Force that were doing that. They were doing it in order to protect themselves. Fair enough, that was a valid point up until the point when these territories were no longer a legitimate way of protecting the population of Artsakh, because they were initially intended at a use during conventional war, during a war when you have troops marching down, sitting in their trenches and marching towards your territory from on the ground.
The classic post-Soviet situation where you've got an army consisting largely of colonels who know how to use tanks and march infantry, but have very little air defense and certainly not much in the way of jets and missiles at their disposal, let alone drones. But in the 2020s, it's a very different situation.
Yes, the whole situation has changed, and Pashinyan also declared in Armenia, he said that, well, I have addressed every single political entity in the country and said that, we're requested to release these territories. And everyone told him that, no, we're going to go to war to try to protect them. But the way the Armenians protected these territories is dubious, to say the least. Now, interestingly, in July, there were also skirmishes in the north of Armenia, in the north of Armenia proper. And there, the military situation was completely different. The Azeri drones didn't help them much. Whenever the Armenian army was involved in a way that it should be involved, the balance between the two isn't what we got here in Artsakh at the moment. Now, going back to what you said about the Russian pre-cooking of the whole situation, well, it is obvious that the Russians have been able to extend their influence through the outcome of this war. And whenever we see something like that happening, then, well, it is more than legitimate to say, well, haven't you been preparing yourselves for this, or haven't you tried achieving something that you could then use for your benefit? And of course they did. Of course they did. It's obvious. On the other hand, did the Armenian interests and the Russian interests coincide here? And that is also true. Of course, they did coincide, because what happened in practice is that the autonomous region of Nagorno-Karabakh, the territory that the Armenians call Artsakh, that territory has a legitimate claim to independence, because the situation of these people and their existential rights, they are being impeded by the Azeri state. They have lived through persecution from the Azerbaijani government.
So this is the same inalienable right to self-assertion and self-determination and ultimately independence and recognition that has been used by the West for decades with regards to Kosovo and East Timor. That certainly applies to the ethnic-Armenian people of Nagorno-Karabakh, that they should become a state.
Armenian people of Nagorno-Karabakh have a far more legitimate claim to independence than does Kosovo. Kosovo has never been a political entity in its whole history. It has never been an autonomous region or anything like that. It was just a part of Serbia populated by the Albanian people. And of course, they've used this remedial solution, because the Albanians of Kosovo were experiencing persecution from the Serbian government. That's their claim. But in the situation of the Armenians of Artsakh, not only were experiencing all the persecution and so forth, but they were also a legitimate government of a territory that was recognized as a sovereign institution under the Soviet law. They were an autonomous region under the Soviet constitution, and autonomy is, of course, a form of a local quasi-statehood. It's not just a random territory where you come and say, okay, now I want my independence here. No, the Armenians have been constituting the majority in that territory, but they were also able to establish some sort of a government that was recognized internationally. So their declaration of independence is far more legitimate in terms of the international law than is the situation in Kosovo. Now, the fact that it hasn't been recognized is another story, because every conflict in the territory of the Soviet Union where Russia has been involved, and wherever it was the Russian interest to recognize the territories, the Russians have recognized them, like Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Crimea. In Crimea, they didn't only recognize the referendum, but they also annexed the whole region and brought it into Russia.
And of course, there's Transnistria or Pridnestrovia, the eastern strip of Moldova, populated by ethnic Russians who want no part of Moldovan statehood.
Transnistria isn't populated just by the Russians. It's populated also by Ukrainians and Moldovans, interestingly. It's mixed population, and the conflict there is not as much ethnic as it is purely political. It's far more difficult to say in that particular instance that there was any persecution of any sort. I mean, no one's ever persecuted the Russians in Moldova. This is completely different in terms of its genesis, this conflict. That situation and the situation in east of Ukraine is, I believe, still to develop. It has a lot of negative potential, especially with the election of Mrs. Sandro as president of Moldova right now, and with the involvement of the Turks in Ukraine, because the Turkish involvement in building the Ukrainian army, rebuilding the Ukrainian army, is growing day to day, and we might witness an escalation in the east of Ukraine further down the line.
Just amplify that a bit for us, Gevorg, because everyone who's been watching the region has said for a long time that Russia, well, those who are anti-Russian would talk, or skeptical would talk about the dead hand of Russia, but a more neutral term would be Russia was feeding clients in the region, of which Armenia was accused of being one, Belarus being another. However, Turkey, possibly with neo-Ottoman aspirations, as it's then now often labelled, or you can just call it Erdogan's personal designs, Turkey also seems to be reviving or forging new client relationships with regional powers. Ukraine, you've mentioned, there's definitely an energy and air force relationship there. You mentioned the distantly, possibly related people of Hungary, and certainly the Hungarian state has a nod to the east, a desire to be in harmony with more of the Asian states and economic prosperity and military links with them, as well as with the EU. You've mentioned Israel, obviously. What is Turkey doing? Is it first and foremost an answer to the air superiority in the region, which is so decisive? Because Russia and Greece together, I think incontrovertibly, would be able to hem in even the powerful Turkish air force in a conventional air war. We see the United Arab Emirates drawn in on the Greek and Russian side here as well now. Or is there more going on than that?
It's a good question. What are Turkey's intentions? What are Turkey's ambitions? What we're seeing at the moment is that Turkey is trying to be so dominant of the Middle Eastern politics, and it clashes with France in that. And it tries to manipulate its relations with Russia in order to further that as well.
For those who are not familiar, France is the patron now of quite a few countries around Turkey. Romania, for example, Egypt, Cyprus, all of these countries, the officer training, the land, sea and air forces seem to be increasingly looking, a bit like the Frankish Crusades period, to France for a lead against the Saracen.
That's true. However, Macron doesn't seem to be any resemblance of Charlemagne. But anyway, the Turks have advanced their relationships across the whole region, and Azerbaijan is, of course, their key ally in the east. They're building their military relationship in a way that it concerns Iran very much, because Israel is involved on the Azerbaijani side, and Iran is always very suspicious of everything that Israel is doing, for a good reason, that is. But that's just the normality, the new normal of our eastern part of Turkey. Now, in the south, we have the Syrian involvement and Iraqi involvement, and that's very problematic for Turkey. The Russians are a counterbalance in Syria, and the Americans and the Iranians are a counterbalance in Iraq.
And the French are a counterbalance, of course, in Libya, which was an Ottoman territory.
That's right. That's right. Libya, Cyprus, Greece, there the French show as much support to Turkey's rivals as is possible, as well as Egypt. But Turkey is looking northwards in Ukraine. You mentioned their military cooperation. They have a very interesting technological cooperation. Some of the engines for those Bayraktar drones that are now very famous are produced in Ukraine. Quite interesting, that. And some of the old production of farms technologies, the main plants that they had in Soviet Union and Ukraine, they have been updated, modernized in order to suit modern military needs, and they're being used by Turkey.
Of course, Ukraine is something like the Pennsylvania of the former Soviet Union. The heavy plant and the know-how is there to this day.
There's a lot that still remains in Ukraine from the Soviet times, but they have been developing slowly their military capacities and so forth. They have some good developments in Ukraine. Mostly private, but still there's some interesting stuff going on there. And then Turkey is able to enhance that by pouring in money, by pouring in specialists, by getting Ukrainians to come to Turkey and work with the Turks in Turkey in order to boost Turkish production, like military production. So there is huge potential. Now, I've been reading accounts of Turkish Bayraktars flying across Donbass area, the Russian-controlled area in Ukraine, and even coming near Crimea, to which the Russian government made a very strong statement. It was said that if one drone falls on the Crimean soil, Constantinople will be a Russian city, and then Kiev too.
It's remarkable how often 1914 like we zoom in on these iconic places like Constantinople or Istanbul as really being the driver of policymakers' thinking to this day. And these are not just idle threats to Westerners. They sound like colourful Oriental turns of phrase, don't they? But these threats have been made good by Russian and other armies in the past in that region.
People now tend to underestimate the Russian potential. Now, even you, in asking your previous question, you said, well, Russia with Greece could do something. Well, from what I'm able to see, I can say that Russia doesn't need a Greece or anyone like Greece to turn the whole of Turkey into what the Russians often call radioactive ashes.
Is this chiefly because of the total integration of operations, which has been a Soviet speciality since the closing years of the Second World War? The operational level in which a commander has disposal of very sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities, as well as the ground assets?
The Russians have their long-term policy in relation to the whole of the region, and their troubles of 1990s and so forth, they have been to some extent redeemed by Putin. Putin was able to place capable people in different spheres of the Russian life. And the Russians now have decided to concentrate on effective weaponry, like the hypersonic rockets that they have produced recently. Something effective, something that can bring immediate effect and sort the question out to Russia's favor as quickly as possible. Because Russia understands that their population is, at least it's not growing very speedily. It's growing mainly thanks to the migrant population that's coming in from mainly Central Asia. The Russians are not able to expand within their own country to have like diversified good production on many different levels. Their economy is not very strong and so forth. But they understand that they need at least one or two things at which they're very, very good to make sure they exist. Because the existence of Russia is it's not enshrined in any holy book, or it's not kind of set in stone. And nobody guarantees that the Russians will have a statehood of their own.
Yeah, it's a massive country, of course, but if you look at the 1,000 years of their history, it's always been a question of will the Orientals or will the German part of Europe, one or the other, completely succeed in chopping up that territory and digesting it. And at many times in history, both of those blocks have managed. So there's absolutely no foregone conclusion that Russia will continue to exist unless it has utter superiority, the kind that some US Navy senior officers seem to be describing now as eye-watering capabilities that can knock out, well, we have to be careful in repeating claims without knowledge, but it seems to be asserted that they can knock out entire carrier groups, much as these are being vaunted by Britain, France, and the US at the moment as a new generation of capability. Or some of the land commanders in the West are saying that their troops wouldn't last 5 minutes against the Russians. That is simply a claim, not one I'm endorsing, but I note that it is being said behind the scenes. So the question, Gevorg, is, with all of the complexity you've just outlined, with a French-led EU defence union with very strong allies in the traditionally Christian and Jewish territories around the Near East, the French in the driving seat there, perhaps, and increasingly an EU defence union, the Germans locked into it, Britain in many ways locked in. Who will that EU defence force go to war with in the region? We have outlined reasons for them to go to war with Russia and reasons for them to go to war with Turkey and its allies. What is the great bloc formation of the Third World War going to be, God forbid, around the Black Sea area?
I don't personally see how EU interests and the Russian interests will clash. I don't see that. I see that the Russian interests and the European interests are pretty much the same at the moment. And that has been proved in Libya, for instance, where the Russians and the French cooperated magnificently to both countries' benefit. The situation in Greece is another example of how Russia doesn't interfere with the European interest. Of course, Germany and France, they want to rely on the Russian resources in one way or another. Germany more than France, but still, they would like to maintain good relations with Russia. They want their oil, they want their gas, they want their good attitude, and the Russians understand that. Now, these are two blocks, of course, the Russian bloc and the European bloc. But I wouldn't necessarily say that they have very contradictory interests. Britain is another matter.
I was wanting to get onto Britain to round off this episode because there's two things we haven't talked about. One is why Britain is on the sidelines. And in fact, since the end of the hot war in 1994 in Nagorno-Karabakh, Britain alone among the semi-major powers at play did not join the OSCE's forum to resolve the conflict, the Minsk group. And since 1994, Britain has been playing an increasingly pro-Turkish position to France's anti-Turkish position with regard to EU accession. With regard to Turkey's place in NATO, Britain has been more along the American line, or even more negative. The US has reasons to keep Turkey on side, such as the Incirlik air base and other strategic interests. But Britain has been playing a slightly questionable game here, has not really formulated a policy on the Armenia Azerbaijan conflict or series of conflicts in the same way that France has formulated a clearly pro-Armenian position. What is going on there?
I wouldn't agree here, Alex. I think Britain has formulated its interest very clearly. For instance, during the war between Artsakh and Azerbaijan, Britain hasn't made a single statement describing and condemning the attack on the Armenian civilian population, even though Azerbaijan has been shelling the Armenian towns of Artsakh every day, and we had casualties in Artsakh that weren't military casualties, they were civilian, and these people suffered without, even participating in the war. Britain hasn't made any statements about that. However, after one attack that the Armenian side, the Artsakh side, has perpetrated against the Azeris, Britain has immediately expressed their condolences and immediately condemned the Armenian vile and vicious attack and all of that. Now, what's behind that is another thing.
Well, I want to get into just that because I can attest to the complete lack of interest at ministerial level or high level in the Foreign Office over the decade of the 2000s, total lack of interest in the South Caucasus. When the French were so eager to stop the Georgian South Ossetian War in 2008 and Bernard Kouchner brokered that ceasefire with involvement of Putin, of course, Britain was a no-show to that conflict resolution. And even more so when we get to Nagorno-Karabakh, policymakers at desk level, whether it's foreign policy, defence or development, are not particularly interested in Britain. Yet there is clearly some British clique steering a pro-Turkish angle here. Who is it?
Look, the day that the war ended between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Artsakh and Azerbaijan, the day that war ended, a representative of the British government was in Azerbaijan traveling to the territories that fell under the Azeri control and discussing gold mining deals with the Azeris. that happened immediately after the war has been stopped. Now, of course, BP is the major stakeholder of the oil transportation system that goes through Azerbaijan and Georgia into Turkey.
So without BP, Azerbaijan would not have its much vaunted defense budget that's bigger than the whole Armenian state budget, because that requires BP expertise.
Without BP, there wouldn't have been Azerbaijan today, I'm pretty sure, because the British have effectively formed the way the state operates and exists. Before British Petroleum, Azerbaijan was just a nomadic territory with many internal conflicts, with one regional leader fighting another, and so forth. The British merchants, as it were able to establish the situation. Well, you have one clique in the government and the Azeri government, and that government is able to enforce whatever they call the law. I mean, they're below any normal standards in terms of human rights and whatever, but
well, this is reminiscent of post Second World War policy. With I know it's largely blamed on the CIA more than MI6, but the coup against Mossadegh in Iran in the 50s, the decision to unseat Assad Jr. in the 2000s, late 2000s, around 2010. Both of these seem to have been crown oil interests being slighted that led to both of those decisions.
Well, here we have that expressed very clearly as well. What adds to the complexity of the situation is that there were more oil fields discovered recently on the Caspian Shelf of the Azeri-controlled area, but also there is gas and oil from Turkmenistan that needs potentially to be transported through Azerbaijan and Armenia into Turkey, which now may as well happen, because previously, because of the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, that wasn't possibly implemented. Of course, the British realized that they need to diversify their routes of transporting gas and oil reserves from Central Asia. Everything so far has been going through Georgia, and Georgia has two major conflicts with Russia, and that's difficult.
And that's an inefficient pipeline, of course, because the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline to get to the Turkish Mediterranean coast to meet the tankers has to dogleg north and then west and then south again to avoid Armenia because of this war.
That's right. It was expensive. It was far more expensive to build that pipeline than it would have been if it had gone through Armenia itself. But that has been already produced. Now there is another project that is potentially coming up, and there's talk of that almost everywhere. Gas from Turkmenistan, oil from Central Asia needs to be, and then Azeri oil needs to be transported through Armenia into Turkey. That will be a lot more efficient financially, and also more stable economically. Because, as you correctly mentioned, the pipeline will be shorter, and also the trading route along that pipeline is going to be much easier to communicate. There's lots involved on the way. There is this Nakhichevan exclave that Azerbaijan holds between Armenia and Turkey.
And that has, although it's a very narrow road, it has a direct road into Turkey, a very short border with actual Turkey, that exclave of Azerbaijan, Nakhichevan, which would mean if a settlement were forced, possibly with some Russian toleration, not exactly connivance, but toleration, you would have surface level and subsoil links running all the way from the Chinese border into Europe without the annoyance of this Armenian situation.
That's correct. But also the interesting part of it is not just the oil and gold and whatever else in commodities that they want to trade in, but also the fact that the whole of this area that we're talking about is right on Iran's border. So it's Iran's northern border that is concerned here, and especially the fact that Israel has its involvement there, and the British definitely have their interest there as well. that could potentially lead to another strain in the Western world's relationship with Iran.
Well, I know that 15 years ago, when Israel was closer to getting the United States to attack Iran on its behalf, the usual claims about the Natanz enrichment facility and so on, I know from being inside the foreign policy establishment at that time that the Azerbaijani ambassador in Washington, D.C., went to see not the State Department people, his counterparts, but went to see Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of State for Defense, in Washington at that time, to lobby him. And Rumsfeld took a liking to him, perhaps because he was wanting to use Azerbaijan as a lily pad, as it would have been called, for invading Iran. And at that time, he wished to butter up the Azeri ambassador and said, "What can we do for you?" So the Azeri ambassador grabbed his moment and said, "Help us to recover Nagorno-Karabakh," to which Rumsfeld is reliably said to have replied, "What is Nagorno-Karabakh?" And then he got the Azeri briefing on it. And apparently someone in the Department of Defense then spent the weekend ginning up a plan for US troops to recover Nagorno-Karabakh for Azerbaijan before the State Department got wind of it on the Monday and rescinded it. So this isn't fantasy. This has happened before, this kind of lobbying.
Yes, we know more or less how these things happen. But what's interesting here is that now that we've been talking about different alliances and power centers in the region and beyond, we have already mentioned at least three. So we have this Russian bloc here, and we have the European bloc, and now this is another British-led cooperation group, whatever you call it.
But what are they, Gevorg? Because we don't have armed forces worth mentioning anymore, sorry to say, but UK Column has been in the lead reporting on that. We don't have a foreign policy establishment that concerns itself with local problems. There are a few very good desk officers and behind them experts at the FCO, but not a great bulk of them. So what identity does this British blob have? Where does it reside that is acting as a bloc in the region?
Well, as far as we're concerned, in this region, we call them the Crown. And what is their identity is not as important to us as it would be to the British society and the people of Britain, because it is up to the people of Britain to think for themselves and to look at the people who are governing them, if they're truly their government and if they're truly representatives of what they believe is their will, their national interest. However, as far as we're concerned, in the Middle East, in Russia, in Eastern Europe, well, parts of Eastern Europe at least, we can certainly see that these cartels that are running the situation, the economic situation here, they are definitely connected to your royal family in Britain. And even some of the Armenian people in power that have been decision makers in this situation, such as the president of Armenia. The president of Armenia is a British subject. He's been living in Britain for half of his life, and he has been granted British citizenship, and he's never renounced it. There's no single document saying that he's ever renounced his British citizenship. He is also a citizen of Armenia, and thereby he's a president of Armenia, has been put there in place by the previous Armenian governments.
And there was this notorious episode in about 2007, I think, when the British ambassador or deputy head of mission was recorded by a microphone in a vase of flowers talking to an opposition party leader, and it was spun, at least by the Armenian state and security service, as Britain fomenting a coup. So clearly Britain does have interests there that certainly weren't obvious to me as one of the intelligence specialists for the region, but they're undeniably there.
It's not publicized, and logically so, understandably so, but it is also very obvious that the British interests, especially after Brexit, are not the same as the European interests. And it's also obvious that the British are far more far warmer in their relationships with the neocon types in the States than they would be with the current Biden administration, for instance.
Which is not how everyone sees it, because they look at Britain's soft power, the BBC propaganda, which, as UK column has been almost alone in pointing out, extends to Kazakhstan through BBC Media Action and other such disguised BBC fronts. There have been soft power projections by Britain throughout the former Soviet Union and the Near East, but they're often assumed to be in line with Sorosism or the US Democratic Party. But you're arguing that it's much more the hawks who are the natural allies of this crown clique stateside.
We should be judging by the fruits, I think. And this internal battle in the US that is definitely going right now hasn't been completely understood and digested yet by the world. The world doesn't understand what's exactly going on there in the United States. But one thing is quite obvious. For as long as Trump was in power and Johnson's cabinet and generally conservative cabinet was running the United Kingdom, the interests of both cabinets were pretty much the same. They did not clash. They did not have any problematic points to the extent that they wouldn't be able to solve them. However, Biden's people have voiced many things that would undermine, for instance, the oil trade in the world. They have made repeated statements about trying to take the world away from oil consumption. Trump has always been trying to produce more oil even in the States and natural gas as well. Biden seems to be wanting to get away from that. And since Britain excels in trying to extract British oil under foreign cents, from under foreign cents and foreign shelves, there might be a problem there down the line. There might be there might be a point when the American government will be saying, "Okay, enough of you British doing this oil business, go into something else, because we're going to decrease the price of oil to such an extent that it will no longer be valuable for you to engage in that."
Which, of course, gives some hope to the likes of the people of Nagorno-Karabakh that having oil in or near their territory is no longer the curse of black gold that it might have been. And you've also gone some way to answer a query in my head as to why Russian analysts like the historian Andrei Fursov talk about the Rockefeller Empire as being a British empire within America and distinct from the other globalist cliques, such as the CFR, that predominate in America. The Russian view is always the Rockefellerian attitude is throwing inflated money around and using oil rather than producing. And so that perhaps gives a sharper analysis of the war of oligarchy within the United States than we have in Britain and America.
Well, to be a little more precise, the Russian view is that wherever there is oil trade going on, the production is there with it. Whereas the opposition side, the other party, they're involved in doing the financial stuff, because if we look at the American financial systems under Obama, what has been going on is that they've been printing as much money as they liked without any hindrance. Whenever America needed new loans or needed money for anything, they just printed the money, and they didn't think twice about that. With Trump, it was difficult. Trump was trying to facilitate production. Trump was trying to bring a more real-life economy in place in that respect. So the Rockefellerian attitude would be, okay, whatever is real, whatever is physical and tangible, that's where we try to put our hand on. We'll try to dominate those areas of life. Whereas the other side, what the Russians would call the more Rothschildian that would be the finances and domination of territories and even the world, perhaps through having the whole world dependent on them financially. But I don't personally see these matters in precisely those terms. What I can say here is this: we definitely have some oil interests. They have been resolved by this war. The Armenian side, even though the Armenians are going to be complaining about the war and they're going to be saying things about the persecution, about the mistreatment of the Armenians by the Azeris, and all of these things are true. I mean, there's lots of horrible things going on, but at the bottom of their national interest, as it were, in Armenia would be this: now that this issue of Artsakh is dominated by Russia completely. There are Russian troops there. The Russians will very likely distribute their Russian passports. Azerbaijan is never going to be able to attack the Russians in that area. That's unquestionable and unthinkable for them to do that. The Armenians that will be living in Artsakh, they will be protected. They'll be able to travel to Armenia freely back and forth. The Armenians haven't really lost much. I mean, they gave up the 7 districts, the 7 regions that were part of Azerbaijan legally anyway. Now, of course, the city of Shushi and the southern town of Hadrut that was part of Artsakh proper, that was taken by the Azeris as well. But who said that the Russians are not going to claim it back and that Aliyev won't have to just leave from those territories and submit them back to Russia if that's going to be the settlement? Because the political side of the issue hasn't been resolved. What's changed is the physical grip over land. However, you have still to go to the Minsk group, the OSCE Minsk group. You need to talk to them if you're the Azeri president, and you have to negotiate with the Armenians. You have to negotiate with the French, with the US, with the Russians, and that's the format where the political resolution to this situation will be brought. So there's still a lot of things that are expected to come. However, right now, this oil trade and so forth, that's no longer a curse to the Armenians, because why wouldn't the Armenians want to benefit from the trade? Of course they would. Of course, from my perspective, the whole thing is utterly immoral. First and foremost here is that if this is your people, your nation, you've got to protect them. And if it involves protecting them with all your military power, then you have to go and do that, because you have to put true values, real values, before some cliques' financial values. And I'm arguing this with the Armenians all the time, even though it's very difficult to get across. But my point always is, look, if you want to build a long-term lasting government, a country that will operate and the country that will be viable in any region, you have to build it on the cornerstones of moral. You shouldn't be trading neither your freedom, neither your values for economic benefits. Now, everybody wants a good economy, but it is utterly important to say we value every citizen that we have, we value the people that we have, and we have to put their interest first. It's not about the land. It shouldn't be about the land. It shouldn't be about the oil. It shouldn't be about the international law even, because everything should be subject to the core values that you have as a society. However, I have been able to see that this approach has been completely abandoned by the government in Armenia, and then so it has been in Azerbaijan and many other places as well. There are very few countries that would actually consider their citizens' interest before they would consider a pile of dosh.
On that rather sobering note, Gevorg, many thanks for our longest podcast so far, packed with useful ruminations. And I do hope that before long I'll be able to interview you again, perhaps looking this time more to Belarus and Poland, an area of the region that we haven't spoken about much, where you have a lot of sensible things to say. But for now, thank you very much. And let's hope you're right that Armenia is now beyond the curse of oil wealth.